The dust cloud rose behind them like a signal fire, and Lillian Zimmerman knew before anyone spoke that they would not wait for her twisted ankle to heal. The wagon train had already lost 3 days to a broken axle outside Fort Laramie, and the trail boss made it clear that California would not come to them. It was September of 1867, and the Sierra Nevada passes would close with the first heavy snow, trapping anyone foolish enough to linger on the wrong side of the mountains. Lillian sat on a flat boulder near the Humboldt River in Nevada Territory, watching the 16 wagons pull away in a ragged line that stretched toward the western horizon. Her older sister Martha had cried, genuinely cried, but her brother-in-law Thomas had been firm. They had 3 children to think about, he said, and winter waited for no one. They left her 2 days of hardtack, a canteen of water, a wool blanket, and promises to send help from the next settlement. Everyone knew those promises meant nothing out here where the land could swallow people whole. She was 22 years old, alone, and the afternoon sun beat down on the sage-covered valley with merciless intensity. Lillian tested her ankle again, wincing as pain shot up her calf. She had stepped wrong that morning while climbing down from her sister's wagon, landing awkwardly on a loose stone. The joint had swollen immediately, purple and hot to the touch. She could barely put weight on it, much less walk the 15 miles a day the wagon train needed to maintain. So they left her, and she could not even summon the energy to hate them for it. Fear took up too much room for hate. The sound of a horse approaching made her reach instinctively for the small pistol Thomas had left her, though she had never fired a gun in her life. A single rider emerged from the heat shimmer to the south, leading a pack mule. He rode with the easy posture of someone who had spent more years in the saddle than on foot, and as he drew closer, Lillian could make out a weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, a dark beard, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything without judgment. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, dusty leather chaps over worn denim, a faded blue shirt, and a bandana tied loosely around his neck. "Saw your train head west without you," he said, reining in his bay gelding a respectful distance away. His voice carried a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or perhaps Arkansas. "That is some impressive leaving." "My ankle," Lillian said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I cannot keep their pace." The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion and walked toward her, moving with a deliberate slowness that she recognized as a way of not frightening her. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 26 or 27, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into sun and wind. His hands, she noticed, were scarred and calloused, but moved with surprising gentleness as he knelt to examine her injury without touching her. "That needs proper rest and cold water," he said. "There is a settlement about 8 miles south of here, place called Silver Creek. Not much more than a trading post and a few buildings, but the woman who runs it knows healing. I am heading that direction regardless. You are welcome to ride the mule if you trust a stranger, which I would not blame you for not doing, but I give you my word I mean you no harm." Lillian looked into his face, searching for deception or worse. She had been warned about men in the territories, about how lawlessness bred predators, but his eyes met hers steadily, and something in her gut, some instinct she had learned to trust back in Missouri, told her this man was offering genuine help. "I am Lillian Zimmerman," she said, "and I suppose I do not have much choice but to trust you." "Fletcher Frost," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "And you do have a choice, Miss Zimmerman. You always have a choice. But I hope you will choose to let me help you reach somewhere safer than a riverbank in the middle of nothing." He helped her onto the mule with careful hands that never lingered inappropriately, then adjusted the pack to make room for her small bundle of belongings. As they started south, Fletcher walked beside his horse rather than riding, setting a pace that was steady but unhurried. Lillian realized with a strange tightness in her chest that he was deliberately slowing down to match what the mule could comfortably manage with an injured rider. "You do not have to walk," she said, after 20 minutes of silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves on hard-packed earth. "I know you could move faster." Speed is not everything, Fletcher said. Getting somewhere intact matters more than getting there quick. Learned that the hard way a few times. Where are you from? The question came out before Lillian could stop it, born from a need to fill the vast emptiness around them with something human. Started in East Texas, near the Louisiana border, town called Marshall. My father ran cattle before the war. After it ended, there was not much left to run, so I came west looking for work. Found it mostly. Drive cattle up from California and Nevada to the mining camps. Do some ranch work when the season is slow. It is a living. He glanced up at her. What about you? You do not sound like someone who grew up planning to cross the mountains. Lillian laughed, though it came out bitter. St. Louis. My father owned a dry goods store. He died 2 years ago, and my mother followed him 6 months later. My sister and her husband decided California offered better prospects than Missouri debt. I came because I had nowhere else to go. That is honest, Fletcher said. Most people dress up their reasons prettier than that. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, and Lillian found herself studying the man leading her toward safety. He moved with the unconscious grace of someone completely at ease in his environment, reading the land like other men read newspapers. Twice he altered their course slightly to avoid rough ground, and once he stopped to let the animals drink from a small spring she never would have noticed. There was a quiet competence about him that she found deeply reassuring after months of traveling with people who argued constantly about which route to take, which river to cross, which pass to attempt. The sun was lowering toward the western mountains when Silver Creek came into view. Fletcher had been generous calling it a settlement. Lillian counted one substantial building made of rough-cut lumber that appeared to serve as trading post, saloon, and possibly hotel all in one. 3 smaller structures huddled nearby, along with a stable and a corral holding perhaps a dozen horses. Smoke rose from a chimney, carrying the smell of cooking meat that made Lillian's stomach clench with hunger. A woman emerged from the main building as they approached, wiping her hands on an apron. She was perhaps 45, with iron-gray hair pulled back severely, and a face that looked like it could cut glass if necessary. But when she saw Lillian's swollen ankle, her expression softened. "Fletcher Frost, what have you brought me this time?" Her voice carried a faint Irish accent worn smooth by years in America. "Found her by the Humboldt. Her wagon train left her behind when she injured her ankle. Figured you could help her better than I could, Mrs. O'Brien." "Get her inside," Mrs. O'Brien said. "All business now. And you, young lady, what is your name?" "Lillian Zimmerman, madam." "Well, Miss Zimmerman, let us see what we can do about that ankle. Fletcher, bring her in and then make yourself useful by tending those animals. You look like you have been riding since dawn." The interior of the trading post was dim and cluttered, but surprisingly clean. Mrs. O'Brien directed Fletcher to set Lillian in a chair near the stone fireplace, then shooed him out to care for his horse and mule. She brought a basin of cold water, clean cloth strips, and a jar of something that smelled strongly of pine and herbs. "Your people left you," she said matter-of-factly as she began to work on Lillian's ankle. "That is the way of it sometimes. They probably told themselves they would send help." "They did say that," Lillian admitted, gritting her teeth as Mrs. O'Brien gently probed the swollen joint. "They will not. They will reach Carson City or Sacramento and convince themselves you found another way, or they will simply forget in the relief of arriving. People are good at forgetting what makes them uncomfortable." She wrapped the ankle with practiced efficiency. "But you are lucky Fletcher found you. He is one of the decent ones, which is rarer than it should be." "How do you know him?" "He stops here 3 or 4 times a year, bringing news from the camps and settlements. Always pays fair, never causes trouble, and once he helped run off some men who thought a woman alone was easy pickings. I trust him, which means you can too." Over the next hour, Lillian learned the rhythms of Silver Creek. It served as a waypoint for prospectors, cowboys, and the occasional wagon train, though most emigrants stuck to the main trails to the north. Mrs. O'Brien ran the trading post with her husband Sean, who was currently in Carson City buying supplies. Three other families lived in the small structures nearby, eking out livings through various combinations of farming, hunting, and providing services to travelers. Fletcher came in after tending the animals, hat in hand, and accepted the plate of venison stew Mrs. O'Brien handed him with quiet thanks. He settled onto a bench across from Lillian, and she noticed he ate with the focused attention of someone who had known real hunger. "Your ankle will heal," Mrs. O'Brien announced, "but you need to stay off it for at least a week, possibly two. You are welcome to stay here. I have a small room in the back you can use. It will cost you some work when you are mobile again, but I do not ask for payment from people in need." "I can pay a little," Lillian said. "I have some money my sister left me." "Save it. You will need it more later." Mrs. O'Brien turned to Fletcher. "I suppose you are heading up to the mining camps?" "Planning to. There is work at a ranch outside Virginia City, and I told them I would be there by week's end." He looked at Lillian, something unreadable in his expression. "But I could postpone a few days if Miss Zimmerman needs watching over." "I do not need watching over," Lillian said more sharply than she intended. Then softer, "But thank you. You have already done more for me than my own family." "I will stay until tomorrow," Fletcher said. "Make sure you are settled proper. The ranch can wait a day or two." That night, Lillian lay in the small room Mrs. O'Brien had provided, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the settlement, dogs barking in the distance, the low murmur of voices from the main room where a few travelers had gathered, the wind moving through the sage with a whisper like rushing water. She should have been terrified, abandoned in the middle of nowhere with nothing but the charity of strangers. Instead, she felt a strange sense of possibility, as if being left behind had actually set her free from a journey that was never truly hers to begin with. She thought about Fletcher Frost, about the way he had slowed his pace without being asked, about the careful distance he maintained that showed respect rather than indifference. In St. Louis, she had been courted by the son of her father's business partner, a perfectly acceptable young man who made her feel absolutely nothing. Her sister had pushed the match, calling Lillian foolish for hesitating. Perhaps she had been foolish. Perhaps she should have married Gerald Patterson and his prospects and his boring reliability. At least she would not be lying in a rough frontier trading post with a twisted ankle and an uncertain future. But she also would not have met a cowboy who walked when he could have ridden, who slowed his pace to match hers without complaint. The next morning, Fletcher appeared to be in no hurry to leave. He helped Mrs. O'Brien repair some loose boards on the corral fence, then spent an hour teaching one of the settlement children, a shy boy of perhaps 8, how to properly care for a horse. Lillian watched from the trading post's front porch, her ankle propped on a stool, and felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. "He is a good man, Mrs. O'Brien said, following her gaze. "Pity there are not more like him." "Do you know anything about his family? Where he came from?" "Only what he has told me over the years. His father died in the war, fighting for the Confederacy, though Fletcher says they never owned slaves and did not believe in the cause. His mother passed from fever in '65. He has a sister somewhere in Texas, married to a shopkeeper. They write occasionally, but she wants him to settle down, and he says he is not ready. Too much restlessness in him, or maybe too much grief he has not worked through yet." Lillian understood grief. It had colors and textures that changed depending on the light. Sometimes her father's death felt like a distant ache. Other times it rose up and choked her without warning. Her mother's passing had been different, slower and more expected, but no less painful. She wondered what Fletcher's grief looked like, whether it drove him across the empty spaces of the West, or whether the movement itself was what kept it at bay. He approached the porch in the early afternoon, carrying his hat. "I should be moving on, Miss Zimmerman. You are in good hands here, and Mrs. O'Brien will see you right." "Thank you," Lillian said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not found me." "Someone else would have come along," Fletcher said, though they both knew that was not necessarily true. The land was full of bones from people who had waited for help that never arrived. Will you come back this way? The question emerged before she could stop it, bold and inappropriate, and completely honest. Fletcher's expression shifted, something flickering in his eyes that might have been hope or interest or simple kindness. I pass through Silver Creek every few months. If you are still here, I would be glad to see you again. If you have moved on, I hope you find whatever you are looking for. He left then, riding north toward the Virginia City Road, and Lillian felt an unexpected sense of loss as she watched him disappear into the distance. Mrs. O'Brien came to stand beside her, saying nothing, which Lillian appreciated more than any platitudes. The days fell into a routine. Lillian's ankle healed slowly, the purple bruising fading to yellow and green before disappearing entirely. She made herself useful around the trading post, helping Mrs. O'Brien with cooking and cleaning and serving the occasional customers who passed through. She learned to recognize the different types of travelers by their gear and their manner. Prospectors had a hungry look in their eyes and talked constantly of strikes and claims. Cowboys moved with that same easy confidence Fletcher had, comfortable in their skin and their purpose. Immigrants always looked exhausted and asked anxious questions about the road ahead. One immigrant family stopped for supplies in mid-October, heading west despite the lateness of the season. Lillian saw the same desperation in their eyes that she imagined had been in Martha's. They had sold everything to make this journey, the father explained, and could not afford to winter over and try again in the spring. Mrs. O'Brien sold them what they needed and sent them off with extra hardtack she claimed was going stale anyway, though Lillian knew that was a lie. Will they make it? Lillian asked after they left. Maybe, if the weather holds and they do not have any bad luck. But that is a lot of ifs. Mrs. O'Brien gave her a sharp look. Still thinking about your sister? Sometimes. I wonder if they made it to California. I wonder if they think about me. They made it. I heard from a supply wagon that came through last week. A train matching their description rolled into Sacramento in late September. As for thinking about you, that is between them and their conscience. Lillian was surprised by the relief she felt. She had not realized how much worry she had been carrying about Martha and the children. The relief was followed immediately by anger, sharp and hot. They had made it safely, had left her to die for all they knew, and would probably never spare her another thought. The anger felt cleaner than the fear, easier to hold. November arrived with cold winds and the first dusting of snow on the surrounding mountains. Fletcher Frost had been gone for 6 weeks. Lillian told herself she was not watching for him, that her frequent glances down the trails leading to Silver Creek were purely casual. She helped Mrs. O'Brien prepare the trading post for winter, insulating walls with packed grass and making sure the woodpile was sufficient. Sean O'Brien returned from Carson City with 2 wagons full of supplies and regaled them with stories of the growing city, the corruption, the wealth pouring out of the Comstock lode mines. You should see Virginia City, he said to Lillian over supper one night. Built right into the side of the mountain, buildings stacked on top of each other like a child's toy blocks. Money flowing like water, though most of it ends up in the wrong pockets. A girl like you could find work there easy, respectable work in a shop or hotel. Maybe, Lillian said non-committally. The truth was she had no idea what she wanted. California had been her sister's dream, not hers. St. Louis was closed to her now, even if she could afford passage back. Silver Creek felt temporary, a way station between one life and the next, but she could not envision what that next life might look like. Fletcher returned on a gray afternoon when the sky threatened snow. Lillian saw him from the trading post window, and her heart did something complicated in her chest, a stumble and recovery that left her breathless. He looked thinner than she remembered, worn down by weeks of hard work, but he sat his horse with the same quiet confidence. Mrs. O'Brien caught her expression, and something like satisfaction crossed her face. Well now, go on out and greet him properly. I should not seem too eager. Child, life is too short and this land is too hard for playing those kinds of games. If you are glad to see him, show it. So Lillian went out into the cold afternoon, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and Fletcher's face when he saw her was worth every moment of waiting. He dismounted and approached her with a smile that transformed his weathered features into something approaching handsome. Miss Zimmerman, I am glad to see you still here and looking well. How is the ankle? Completely healed. I can walk just fine now, she demonstrated, turning in a small circle. That is good. That is real good. He seemed to struggle for words, unusual for someone normally so self-possessed. I was thinking about you, up in Virginia City, wondering if you were recovering all right, if Mrs. O'Brien was treating you decent. She has been wonderful, but I am glad you came back. Lillian took a breath, deciding Mrs. O'Brien was right about games. I was hoping you would. Something shifted in Fletcher's expression, uncertainty giving way to cautious hope. Were you? That is good to hear. I have been finding excuses to pass through Silver Creek more often than I usually do. Told myself it was because Mrs. O'Brien makes better stew than anyone else in the territory, but that was only partly true. They stood there in the cold afternoon, grinning at each other like fools, and Lillian felt something settle into place inside her chest. This, her heart seemed to say, this is what it should feel like. Over the following days, Fletcher found reasons to stay at Silver Creek. His horse needed shoeing, he said, and then the pack mule developed a slight limp that required rest. He helped Sean O'Brien with repairs to the stable roof and taught Lillian how to shoot the pistol she still carried, taking her out into the sage where they spent hours practicing on makeshift targets. His hands were gentle when he corrected her grip, his voice patient when she missed shot after shot. You are flinching, he said, anticipating the noise. Try to relax into it. Easy for you to say. But she tried again, and this time the bottle she had aimed at exploded in a satisfying spray of glass. There, Fletcher said, and his pride in her accomplishment felt more valuable than gold. They talked while the sun set over the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible for nature to produce. Fletcher told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the war that had torn his family apart even though they fought for the side they did not believe in. His father had joined the Confederate Army out of loyalty to neighbors and friends, but had written letters home expressing his horror at the carnage and waste. He died at Shiloh, Fletcher said quietly. Took a bullet meant for someone else, apparently. They said he died quick. I hope that is true. I hope he did not lie there in pain, thinking about what he was leaving behind. Lillian reached out and took his hand, a bold gesture that would have scandalized the society ladies of St. Louis. Fletcher's fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused and solid. My father died slowly, she said. Consumption. We watched him waste away for 8 months, coughing up blood and apologizing for the burden he represented. Sometimes I think quick might be better. At least you do not have to watch them disappear piece by piece. I am sorry, Fletcher said, and the simple sincerity of it made her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. They sat in the gathering darkness, hands clasped, and Lillian felt the careful walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble. This was dangerous, she knew. Fletcher was a drifter, a cowboy who moved with the seasons and the work. He had no roots, no permanent home, nothing to offer a woman looking for security. But she was not looking for security anymore. Her safe, planned future had abandoned her by the Humboldt River. What she wanted now was something real, something that burned hot enough to keep the loneliness at bay. I should get back, she said finally. Mrs. O'Brien will wonder where I am. She knows, Fletcher said with a slight smile. That woman does not miss much. He walked her back to the trading post, still holding her hand, and when they reached the door, he turned to face her in the lamplight spilling from the windows. For a moment, Lillian thought he might kiss her, and her heart hammered against her ribs in anticipation. but Fletcher simply raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, old-fashioned and courtly. "Good night, Miss Zimmerman." "Lillian," she said. "Please call me Lillian." "Good night, Lillian." She watched him walk toward the stable where he had been sleeping in the loft, then went inside to find Mrs. O'Brien pretending to be very busy with inventory. "Do not say anything," Lillian warned. "I was not planning to," Mrs. O'Brien replied, but her smile said everything words could not. December brought serious cold and enough snow to make travel difficult. A few hardy souls still passed through Silver Creek, but most people with any sense were settled into winter quarters, waiting for spring to resume their wandering. Fletcher stayed on, taking a job helping Sean O'Brien with various projects around the settlement. He built a new chicken coop for one of the neighboring families, repaired a wagon for a prospector planning to head out at first thaw, and spent long hours in the stable working with horses that needed training or rehabilitation. Lillian watched him work whenever she could, admiring the easy strength in his movements and the patience he showed with even the most difficult animals. He had a gift for gentling fractious horses, talking to them in a low voice while he worked until they calmed under his hands. She thought about how he had gentled her fears that first day by the Humboldt River, offering help without pressure, giving her space to choose. They fell into an unspoken courtship, conducted with the proper restraint of two people aware they were living in someone else's home under watchful eyes. They took walks when the weather permitted, picking their way through snow to look at the frost patterns on the river or watch ravens circle overhead. They sat together by the fire in the evenings, playing cards or reading from the small collection of books Mrs. O'Brien kept. Sometimes they just talked, the easy conversation of people learning each other's rhythms and thoughts. On Christmas Eve, such as it was this far from civilization, Fletcher gave Lillian a gift wrapped in brown paper. She opened it to find a pair of leather gloves, beautifully made and clearly expensive. "I noticed your hands getting chapped," he said, suddenly shy. "The cold out here is different from Missouri. Drier, I thought these might help." "They are beautiful," Lillian said, slipping them on. "They fit perfectly." "Thank you, Fletcher." "I did not get you anything. I did not know we were exchanging gifts. Your company is gift enough." He said it simply, as fact rather than flattery, and Lillian felt her heart turn over in her chest. She kissed him then, rising on her toes to press her lips against his. For a moment Fletcher went still with surprise. Then his arms came around her, and he kissed her back with a tenderness that made her knees weak. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Mrs. O'Brien's voice came from the direction of the kitchen. "About time." They spent Christmas Day helping Mrs. O'Brien prepare a feast for everyone at Silver Creek. It was not much, perhaps 20 people total, but the gathering had a warmth that Lillian had not felt since before her parents died. They sang songs, told stories, and shared what food they had. Fletcher sat beside her, their hands clasped under the table, and Lillian allowed herself to imagine a future she had not dared to dream before. January arrived with brutal cold and storms that kept everyone close to shelter. Lillian and Fletcher spent hours talking by the fire, and she learned more about the man behind the quiet exterior. He had worked as a ranch hand, a trail driver, a guard for mining payrolls, and once, briefly, as a deputy in a small town that no longer existed. He moved because staying still made him restless, but he was starting to think maybe that restlessness was less about wandering and more about not having a reason to settle. "What would make you settle?" Lillian asked one night when they were alone, Mrs. O'Brien having retired early and Sean off playing cards with neighbors. Fletcher looked at her for a long moment, his expression serious. "The right reason, the right person. I never saw much point in putting down roots alone. My father always said a home is not a place, it is who you share it with." I think he was right about that. "And have you found that person?" Her heart hammered so hard, she thought he must be able to hear it. "I think I might have," Fletcher said quietly. "If she would have me. If she could see a future with a cowboy who does not have much to offer except himself." Lillian set down the sock she had been darning and moved to sit beside him on the bench. What if that is exactly what she wants? What if all the security and planning in the world means nothing without someone who would slow his pace to match hers? Fletcher's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. Then I would tell her I love her. I would tell her I have loved her since I found her sitting by that river, brave and scared and too proud to beg. I would tell her I want to build a life with her, whatever that looks like, wherever that takes us. I love you too, Lillian whispered. I did not know I could feel this way about someone. You make me want things I never let myself imagine before. They kissed again, deeper this time, and Lillian felt the last of her careful control slip away. This was real. This was happening. This cowboy with his scarred hands and patient heart loved her, and she loved him back with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. Marry me, Fletcher said against her lips. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few months, but I am certain about this. I am certain about you. Marry me, Lillian. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, absolutely yes. Mrs. O'Brien found them wrapped in each other's arms and just nodded with satisfaction, as if she had predicted this exact outcome from the moment Fletcher brought Lillian through her door. They were married on a clear February morning by a circuit preacher who happened through Silver Creek on his rounds. It was a simple ceremony conducted in the trading post's main room with Mrs. O'Brien, Sean, and a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Lillian wore the best dress she owned, a blue calico that had survived the journey from Missouri. Fletcher wore a new shirt Mrs. O'Brien had helped him buy from the trading post's limited inventory. They spoke their vows with steady voices and meant every word. Afterward, there was a small celebration with food and drink, and then Fletcher took Lillian's hand and led her out into the cold sunshine. They walked to the stable where he showed her what he had been working on for the past 2 weeks. A wagon, sturdy and well built, with a canvas cover and supplies packed carefully inside. I have been thinking, Fletcher said. Silver Creek is a good place, but it is not our place. I heard about a valley south of here, down near the California border. Good grazing land, water year-round, and cheap because most people are too busy chasing gold to think about ranching. I have some money saved. Not a lot, but enough to file a homestead claim and get started with a small herd. What would you think about building something of our own? Lillian looked at the wagon, then at her husband's face and saw both hope and uncertainty there. He was offering her a choice, not an obligation, the chance to build something together rather than following someone else's dream. I think it sounds perfect, she said. When do we leave? Spring, another month or two, when the weather breaks and the roads are passable. I want to do this right, Lillian. I want to give you a real home, not just wandering. They left Silver Creek in early April when the snow had melted and the first green shoots pushed through the hard ground. Mrs. O'Brien cried when they said goodbye, making Lillian promise to write and visit when they could. Sean shook Fletcher's hand and slipped him extra supplies, refusing payment. The other families came to see them off, these people who had been strangers 6 months ago and now felt like friends. The journey south took 3 weeks of steady but unhurried travel. Fletcher maintained the same measured pace he had used that first day, never pushing too hard, always making sure Lillian was comfortable. They made love in the wagon under the stars, learning each other's bodies with a wonder and tenderness that made Lillian grateful she had waited for the right person. They talked about their plans for the homestead, dreaming out loud about the house they would build and the life they would create. The valley Fletcher had heard about exceeded their expectations. It spread between low mountains, green with spring grass and watered by a creek that ran clear and cold even in summer. There were a few other homesteads visible in the distance, but plenty of unclaimed land for those willing to work it. They filed their claim at the land office in the nearest town, a place called Ridgeway, about 10 miles east, and began the hard work of building a life. That first year tested them in ways Lillian had not imagined. They lived in the wagon while Fletcher built a one-room cabin from timber he cut and hauled from the surrounding mountains. Lillian learned to cook over an open fire, to preserve food, to make soap and candles from tallow. Her hands grew rough and her back ached constantly, but she fell into bed each night beside her husband and felt a satisfaction she had never experienced in her comfortable St. Louis life. Fletcher worked from dawn until dark, building fences, clearing land, and acquiring a small herd of cattle from a rancher willing to extend credit. He taught Lillian to ride, laughing as she bounced ungracefully in the saddle, but patient as she slowly developed her seat and confidence. They worked side by side, branding calves, mending tack, hauling water, all the 1,000 tasks that went into establishing a ranch. By summer, the cabin was finished, small but solid, with a real floor and a stone fireplace. Lillian planted a garden that somehow survived her inexperience and produced enough vegetables to supplement the game Fletcher shot and the beef they butchered. They made friends with their nearest neighbors, a family named Morrison with 3 young children who were grateful for the help Fletcher provided with heavy work. In August, Lillian realized she was pregnant. She told Fletcher one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset, and his face went through a rapid series of expressions before settling on pure joy. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby? Are you happy?" Lillian asked, suddenly uncertain. "I know we are only just getting established. I know the timing might not be ideal." Fletcher pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I am more than happy. I am grateful and terrified, and so full of love I do not know what to do with it all. We will manage, Lillian. We will make this work." They did manage, though the pregnancy was harder than Lillian expected. Morning sickness lasted well into the 4th month, and as her belly grew, the physical demands of ranch work became increasingly difficult. Fletcher took on extra chores without complaint and hired a young man from Ridgeway to help with the heaviest tasks. Mrs. Morrison came over regularly to help with cooking and cleaning, becoming the friend and mother figure Lillian desperately needed. Their son was born on a cold March morning in 1869, delivered by Mrs. Morrison with Fletcher hovering anxiously nearby. Lillian held the squalling baby and felt a love so fierce it threatened to consume her. They named him Frederick Fletcher Frost, and Fletcher wept as he held his son for the first time, all his usual stoicism stripped away. "He is perfect," Fletcher said hoarsely. "You are perfect. I do not know what I did to deserve this, but I swear I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of it." The next few years blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and joy. Frederick grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's quiet determination and his mother's curiosity. The ranch expanded slowly but steadily. Fletcher's reputation for fair dealing and quality stock brought buyers to their door, and they were able to pay off their debts and even save a little money. They added rooms to the cabin until it became a proper house. Lillian planted flowers along the fence line and made curtains for the windows, small touches that transformed a shelter into a home. In 1871, Lillian gave birth to a daughter they named Lily Ann, a delicate baby with dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival to the entire valley. Frederick, now 2.5, was fascinated by his new sister and insisted on helping with everything from diaper changes to feedings. Fletcher walked around with an expression of bemused wonder, as if he could not quite believe his good fortune. The ranch prospered. They acquired more land, built a proper barn, and hired 2 full-time hands to help manage the growing herd. Fletcher drove cattle to market in San Francisco twice a year, returning with money to invest in improvements and small luxuries. He bought Lillian a proper stove to replace the fireplace for cooking, glass windows for all the rooms, and once, a music box that played a tinny but charming version of Beautiful Dreamer. She cried when he gave it to her, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. Life was not without hardships. They lost half their herd to disease one terrible summer and had to rebuild slowly. A kitchen fire destroyed part of the house and forced them to live in the barn for 2 months while repairs were made. Frederick broke his arm, falling from a horse, and Lillian spent a terrifying night convinced they would lose him to infection before the fever finally broke. But they weathered each crisis together, their bond growing stronger with every challenge overcome. In 1874, a letter arrived from St. Louis. Lillian stared at her sister's handwriting on the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was a brief note explaining that Martha's husband Thomas had died in an accident at the sawmill where he worked. Martha was struggling to support 3 children alone in Sacramento and wondered if Lillian might be willing to help, perhaps with a small loan or by taking one of the children for a while. Lillian showed the letter to Fletcher that evening after the children were in bed. He read it carefully, then looked at her with understanding in his eyes. "What do you want to do?" "I do not know," Lillian said honestly. "Part of me is still angry they left me. Part of me remembers that Martha cried when they drove away. And part of me just feels sad that life has been hard for her too." "We could help," Fletcher said slowly. "We have the room and the resources now. We could invite them here, give Martha work and the children a stable home." Lillian looked around their warm kitchen, thought about the life they had built through hard work and love, and made her decision. "Yes, let us help them, but only if they come here, on our terms. I will not send money into the void hoping it helps. If Martha wants assistance, she will have to accept it face to face and acknowledge what she did." They sent the invitation, and Martha arrived with her 3 children in late summer. The reunion was awkward and emotional, with Martha weeping and apologizing while Lillian stood stiff and unsure how to respond. But Fletcher's steady presence and the innocent friendliness of Frederick and Lily Ann helped ease the tension. Martha and her children moved into one of the newly built outbuildings that had been intended for a foreman, and Martha began helping Lillian with the housework and garden. It took time, but slowly Lillian and Martha rebuilt their relationship. They would never be as close as they once were. Too much pain stood between them, too many what-ifs and if-onlys. But they found a way to be sisters again, united by shared history and the bonds of family. Martha proved to be a hard worker, grateful for the second chance, and her children thrived in the open spaces of the ranch. The years continued their steady progression. Fletcher's hair began to show gray at the temples, and lines deepened around his eyes, but he remained strong and capable. Lillian developed a talent for ranch management that surprised them both, keeping meticulous records and making shrewd decisions about breeding and sales. Together they built something substantial, a ranch that employed a dozen people and ran several thousand head of cattle across deeded land and open range. In 1877, Lillian gave birth to their 3rd child, another son they named Samuel. Frederick was now 8 and already showing the quiet competence that marked his father. Lily Ann was 6, a whirlwind of energy and questions who kept everyone on their toes. The house rang with children's laughter, and Lillian sometimes paused in her work to marvel at how far she had come from that desperate woman abandoned by the Humboldt River. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Fletcher took her hand and raised it to his lips, just as he had that first night at Silver Creek. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying when I found you? Marrying me instead of going on to California or back to St. Louis?" Lillian turned to look at her husband, this man who had slowed his pace to match hers all those years ago, and never once complained about the adjustment. His face in the fading light was as dear to her as breathing, weathered by sun and wind and time, but still the face of the man who had offered help without expectation of reward. "Regret it? Fletcher, marrying you was the best decision I ever made. You gave me a life I never knew I wanted. You gave me love I never thought I would find. You gave me a home, not just a place, but a feeling. How could I possibly regret any of that?" Fletcher pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and sage and the particular sweetness that was just him. Around them, their ranch settled into evening, cattle lowing in the distance, horses shifting in the corral, the soft sounds of Martha putting her children to bed in the outbuilding. Inside their house, Frederick was helping Lily Ann with her letters, while baby Samuel slept in his cradle. It was an ordinary evening on an ordinary ranch in a valley most people had never heard of. It was everything. The sound of hoofbeats approaching drew their attention. A rider emerged from the twilight, and as he drew closer, Fletcher stood and moved to the porch rail. The rider was a young man, perhaps 19 or 20, travel-worn and dusty. "Help you with something?" Fletcher called out. The young man reined in his horse and touched his hat brim respectfully. "Looking for Fletcher Frost. Heard he runs a good outfit and might have work for a willing hand." "You heard right. I am Fletcher Frost." He studied the young man with a practiced eye. "You have experience with cattle?" "Some, sir. Worked ranches in Texas before heading west. I am handy with horses, too, and I do not mind hard work." Fletcher glanced at Lillian, who gave him a small nod. They could always use another hand, especially someone young and eager. "Bunkhouse is that building there. Get yourself settled and report to my foreman in the morning. He will see what you can do. We pay fair wages and feed our people well, but we expect a full day's work." "Thank you, sir. I appreciate the chance." The young man started to turn his horse, then paused. "If you do not mind my asking, how did you build all this? Everyone I talk to says you started with nothing." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, then he smiled and put his arm around Lillian's shoulders. "I found the right reason to settle down. Everything else followed from that." The young man looked confused but polite, then nodded and rode toward the bunkhouse. Lillian leaned into her husband's side and laughed softly. "That was cryptic. Some things cannot be explained, only experienced." Fletcher kissed the top of her head. "Come on, let us go check on the children before they burn the house down with too much learning." They went inside together, and through the window, the last light of day faded into star-filled darkness. The valley stretched out in all directions, wild and beautiful and home. Years flowed like the creek that watered their land, constant and life-giving. Frederick grew into a young man who loved the ranch as much as his parents did, taking on more responsibility with each passing season. He had his father's patience with animals and his mother's head for business, a combination that promised well for the future. Lillian remained spirited and curious, eventually announcing at 15 that she wanted to become a teacher and going off to study at a school in Sacramento. Samuel, the youngest, showed an artistic temperament that initially worried Fletcher until he realized the boy's ability to really see horses, to capture their essence in his sketches, was actually a tremendous asset in breeding decisions. Martha's children grew up alongside their cousins, the earlier division between the families slowly healing. Martha herself mellowed over the years. The bitterness of her earlier losses transformed into gratitude for the second chance she had been given. She eventually married one of the ranch hands, a widower named Tom Collins, who treated her with gentle respect and moved with him to a small homestead on the edge of their property. The railroad reached their part of California in 1881, transforming the economics of ranching. Fletcher and Lillian adapted, shipping cattle east to new markets and bringing in breeding stock from as far away as Scotland. The ranch that had started as a desperate gamble became one of the most respected operations in the region, known for quality animals and fair dealing. They returned to Silver Creek once in the summer of 1883. Mrs. O'Brien was older and slower, but still running the trading post with the same iron determination. She wept when she saw them, hugging Lillian and then Fletcher with the fierce affection of someone who had genuinely cared about their fate. "I knew you would do well," she said, wiping her eyes. "I knew at the moment Fletcher brought you through that door. You both had something special, even if you did not see it yet yourselves." They stayed for 3 days, introducing their children to the place where their parents' story had truly begun. Frederick listened with wide eyes to tales of his mother's injury and abandonment. Lily Ann wanted to know every detail of the courtship. Samuel wandered the settlement, sketching the buildings and the landscape with quiet intensity. On their last evening, Fletcher and Lillian walked down to the Humboldt River, to the place where he had first found her. The boulder where she had sat nursing her twisted ankle was still there, weathered by years of sun and wind. "Do you remember what you thought when you saw me?" Lillian asked, standing beside the rock. "I thought you were the bravest person I had ever seen," Fletcher said, sitting there alone, terrified but refusing to show it, facing down whatever came with nothing but determination. "I thought if I rode away and left you, I would regret it for the rest of my life. And you slowed down for me. You did not have to. You could have left me here with Mrs. O'Brien and gone on your way, but you slowed down." Fletcher pulled her close, and even after 16 years of marriage, the feeling of his arms around her still made Lillian's heart beat faster. Some things are worth slowing down for. Some people are worth matching pace with. That has never been a sacrifice, Lillian. It has only ever been a gift. They stood there as the sun set over the western mountains, two people who had found each other in the vastness of an unforgiving land and built something lasting from that chance encounter. Around them, the desert prepared for night, the temperature dropping, and stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The next morning, they said goodbye to Mrs. O'Brien and started the journey home, their wagon full of supplies and their hearts full of memories. Silver Creek disappeared behind them, but what it represented, that place of healing and new beginnings, traveled with them always. Life continued its forward motion. Frederick married at 23, bringing home a smart, capable young woman named Emma who had grown up on a neighboring ranch. They moved into a house Fletcher built for them on the property, and within 2 years, Lillian and Fletcher became grandparents to twin boys who filled the ranch with a new generation of noise and energy. Lily Ann finished her education and returned to teach at the school in Ridgeway, though she still came home every weekend. Samuel studied art formally, but chose to remain at the ranch, creating paintings of the landscape and cattle that began to sell to wealthy buyers in San Francisco and even back east. Fletcher's hair turned fully gray and then white, but he remained active and engaged with the ranch until a bad fall from a horse in 1889 left him with a limp that never fully healed. He was 50 that year, and for the first time, he began talking about stepping back and letting Frederick take over more of the day-to-day operations. Lillian, now 44, still managed the books and business affairs with sharp attention to detail, but she too felt the weight of years and hard work. They began taking more time for themselves, long rides into the mountains in summer, quiet evenings reading by the fire in winter. They visited their grandchildren and spoiled them shamelessly. They attended dances and socials in Ridgeway, moving slowly across the floor together, still comfortable in each other's space after more than 20 years of marriage. One evening in 1891, sitting on the porch of the house they had built with their own hands, watching the sun paint the sky in impossible colors, Lillian realized she was completely content. Not happy in the breathless, excited way of youth, but content in the deep, bone-level satisfaction of a life well lived. She had a husband who loved her, children and grandchildren who brought joy, work that challenged and fulfilled her, and a home that reflected everything she and Fletcher had built together. "What are you thinking about?" Fletcher asked, noticing her expression. "Everything. Nothing. How strange life is. 24 years ago, I was sitting by a river, abandoned and terrified, certain I was going to die alone in the desert. Now look at all this." She gestured at the ranch spread before them, the neat fences and solid buildings, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. "Sometimes it feels like it happened to someone else. But it did not," Fletcher said. "It happened to you, to us. We built this, Lillian, from nothing but determination and love and a willingness to slow down long enough to see what mattered." That night they made love slowly, with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion that had never quite faded. Afterward, lying in each other's arms in the darkness, Lillian thought about the many ways a life could turn on single moments. If the wagon train had not left her, if Fletcher had not come along that particular road on that particular day, if he had been a different kind of man, the kind who rode on instead of stopping to help. Any of those variables changed, and she would have lived an entirely different existence, or perhaps not lived at all. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. For what? Fletcher's voice was drowsy, content. For slowing down, for seeing me, for loving me enough to build this life. You never have to thank me for that. It was never a choice, Lillian. From the moment I saw you by that river, there was only ever one path forward, and it led here, to you, to this. I would make the same decision 1,000 times over. The years continued their gentle progression. The ranch adjusted to the changing times, adapting to new markets and new technologies while maintaining the core values Fletcher and Lillian had established. They celebrated their silver wedding anniversary in 1894 with a massive party that drew friends and family from across California and beyond. Mrs. O'Brien came, impossibly old now but still sharp-eyed and quick-witted. Martha and Tom came with their grown children. The Morrison family came, 3 generations of them now. The ranch hands, past and present, came to honor the people who had built something real and lasting. Frederick, now 25 and fully in charge of operations, gave a toast that made both his parents tear up. My father always said a home is not a place, but who you share it with. My parents proved that every day of my life. They took nothing but love and determination and built all of this. They showed us what partnership really means, what commitment looks like when it is not just words, but action. They slowed down for each other, matched pace, and never left anyone behind. That is the example they set, and it is one I hope to follow for the rest of my life. The party lasted until dawn, and when everyone finally dispersed, Fletcher and Lillian stood alone in their yard watching the sunrise. They looked at each other and started laughing, the helpless laughter of exhaustion and joy and the sheer absurdity of having survived long enough to celebrate 25 years together. We did all right, Fletcher said, when he could speak again. We did better than all right, Lillian corrected. We did beautifully. The turn of the century came with celebration and reflection. Lillian, now 55, looked in the mirror and saw a woman transformed by time and experience. Her dark hair was threaded with silver, her face lined by sun and wind and laughter, her hands rough from work. She looked nothing like the young woman who had left St. Louis chasing her sister's dream. That woman had been soft and uncertain, shaped by other people's expectations. This woman, the one looking back from the mirror, knew exactly who she was and what she had accomplished. Fletcher, at 60, had slowed considerably but remained engaged with the ranch and family. He spent hours with his grandchildren, teaching them about horses and cattle and the land that had given them all so much. He still rode out most mornings, though he limited himself to shorter distances and easier terrain. His limp had become more pronounced, and sometimes on cold mornings he moved stiffly, but his eyes remained clear and his mind sharp. They began working together on a project to document the history of the ranch, writing down stories and dates and details for future generations. Lillian discovered she enjoyed the process, the way memory shifted and reformed when examined closely. She wrote about her journey west, about being left behind, about Fletcher's appearance like an answer to a prayer she had not quite formed. She wrote about the early years of struggle, the joy of their children's births, the slow building of success. Fletcher read her words and added his own perspective, and together they created a record of their life that felt honest and true. In 1903, Lillian woke one morning to find Fletcher had not risen with his usual early hour. She found him in bed, breathing shallowly, his face gray. The doctor, summoned hastily from Ridgeway, diagnosed a heart condition and prescribed rest and limited activity. For a man who had worked every day of his adult life, the enforced idleness was torture, but Fletcher submitted with as much grace as he could manage. Lillian barely left his side during those months. She read to him, played cards with him, helped him take short walks around the yard when the weather permitted. They talked about everything and nothing, revisiting their shared history and imagining the future they might not both live to see. Frederick stepped up to run the ranch entirely, and the grandchildren visited constantly, bringing noise and energy that made Fletcher smile even on his worst days. "I am not afraid," Fletcher told her one evening as they sat together, watching the sunset from their bedroom window. "I have had a good life, Lillian, better than I ever imagined possible. I have loved you and been loved by you. I have children and grandchildren who make me proud. I have built something lasting. If it ends tomorrow, I will have no complaints." "Do not talk like that," Lillian said fiercely, though tears streamed down her face. "You are not going anywhere. You are too stubborn to die." Fletcher took her hand and held it gently. "We are all going somewhere eventually, but I promise you, whatever comes, wherever I go, I will be waiting for you. We will find each other again, just like we found each other by the Humboldt River. Some connections do not end, Lillian. They just change form." He lingered through summer and into fall, rallying periodically before falling back into weakness. On a clear October morning, with Lillian holding his hand and their children gathered around the bed, Fletcher Frost died peacefully in his sleep. He was 63 years old. The funeral drew hundreds of people, testimony to the impact Fletcher had made during his life. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath an oak tree he had admired, with a simple headstone that read, "Fletcher Frost, 1840-1903." He slowed his pace. Lillian chose the inscription, and everyone who knew their story understood exactly what it meant. The months after Fletcher's death were the hardest of Lillian's life, harder even than being abandoned in the desert. She moved through days numb and hollow, going through motions without feeling. The ranch continued around her, life continuing its relentless forward motion, but she felt disconnected from all of it. Her children worried, gently suggesting she move in with one of them, but Lillian refused. This house, this ranch was soaked in Fletcher's presence. She would not abandon it. Slowly, painfully, she began to heal. She found comfort in working with the grandchildren, teaching them the skills Fletcher had taught her. She rode out to visit Fletcher's grave regularly, sitting beneath the oak tree and talking to him about ranch business and family news. She took up painting, inspired by Samuel's work, finding solace in capturing the landscape they had loved together. 2 years after Fletcher's death, Lillian received a letter from Mrs. O'Brien's daughter. The old woman had passed peacefully in her sleep, and the family was closing the Silver Creek trading post. Would Lillian like any mementos? Lillian wrote back asking for the bench where she and Fletcher had first really talked, and it arrived some weeks later, battered but serviceable. She placed it on the porch, and sitting there, she could almost feel Fletcher beside her. Life continued. Frederick and Emma had more children, filling the ranch with young voices. Lillian married a fellow teacher and moved to Sacramento, but visited often. Samuel's paintings began appearing in galleries, bringing recognition and some wealth. The ranch adapted to the automobile age, buying trucks to supplement the horses and wagons. The world changed, sometimes faster than seemed comfortable, but the fundamental rhythms of ranching remained constant. Lillian lived to see her great-grandchildren, tiny humans who carried her blood and Fletcher's forward into a future neither of them could have imagined. She told them stories about their great-grandfather, about the cowboy who had slowed his pace for a woman with a twisted ankle and built an empire on that single act of kindness. She made sure they understood that success was not measured in acres or cattle, but in the lives you touched and the love you shared. On a spring morning in 1920, Lillian woke feeling peaceful and strangely light. She was 75 years old, and her body had grown frail, but her mind remained clear. She dressed carefully, put on the leather gloves Fletcher had given her that first Christmas, now soft and worn with decades of use, and walked slowly to Fletcher's grave. She sat beneath the oak tree, now large and spreading, and looked out over the valley they had claimed together. The ranch spread in all directions, prosperous and thriving, a testament to everything they had built. In the distance, she could see Frederick directing ranch hands, see the house where multiple generations now lived, see the future they had created from nothing but love and determination. "I think I am ready now," she said quietly to the gravestone beside her. I have done what I needed to do. Our children are grown and thriving. The ranch is secure. The grandchildren and great grandchildren know where they came from. I have told our story enough times that it will not be forgotten. I am ready to find you again, Fletcher. I am ready to see what comes next. She closed her eyes, feeling the sun warm on her face and the breeze soft in her hair, and she imagined she could hear Fletcher's voice carried on the wind, patient and loving, saying what he always said when she was afraid or uncertain. I am here, Lillian. I am right here. They found her later that afternoon, peaceful beneath the oak tree, a slight smile on her face. They buried her beside Fletcher, and her gravestone read simply, Lillian Zimmerman Frost, 1845, 1920. She kept pace. Together, the stones told their story, a narrative of love and partnership that had started with a chance encounter in the vast wilderness and grown into something that touched generations. The ranch continued, passing from Frederick to his children, and then to their children, the story of how it began, of a cowboy who slowed his pace for a woman left behind, became family legend told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. Fletcher and Lillian's house was preserved, turned into a museum of sorts where visitors could see the original cabin expanded into a home, could read the letters and journals they had left behind, could stand on the porch where they had spent so many evenings watching the sun set over their valley. Their love story became more than just their own. It became a symbol of what was possible when people chose kindness over convenience, when they matched pace instead of rushing ahead, when they built together instead of alone. Students studying Western history learned about their ranch as an example of successful homesteading. Sociologists pointed to their partnership as a model of equality, unusual for their time. Artists and writers found inspiration in the simple narrative of two people who found each other in the wilderness and refused to let go. But perhaps most importantly, their descendants carried forward the values Fletcher and Lillian had embodied, the importance of slowing down for those who needed help, the power of choosing partnership over independence, the beauty of building something lasting from foundations of love and respect. Generation after generation learned those lessons, and the ranch they had started became not just land and cattle, but a living testament to what two people could create when they were willing to match pace and walk together. The story that began beside the Humboldt River in 1867, with a woman abandoned and a cowboy who stopped to help, echoed forward through time, touching lives and shaping futures in ways neither Fletcher nor Lillian could have predicted. They had slowed down for each other, matched pace, and in doing so had created something that would outlast them both. Their love had not just sustained them through difficult times, it had built a legacy that would endure for generations, a reminder that sometimes the greatest journeys begin not when we rush ahead, but when we slow down long enough to truly see each other.